Good morning, and welcome to Calvary Covenant Church Online. My name is Kendall Churchill, and as always, it is so good to be with you. Make sure to check out the videos that we're uploading this week as we approach Christmas. We're going to have some extra services and music and all sorts of great things. So take some time to look into that this week. Now, have you ever received more than you were expecting in a positive way? That you were expecting one thing and then you got something even bigger and better? I remember there was a time when I signed up to be part of a focus group, those surveys where they pay people to give their opinion on things. And so I showed up, I was selected to do one, so I showed up at this place and there's a room full of people and they invited people in to take part of this focus group. And as they invited people in, it was about soda pop flavors and such. We were all drinking our sodas. And as they invited everyone in, I wasn't one of the people they invited. And so I was waiting in the lobby, just sitting there with a couple other people, and the receptionist came back and said, unfortunately, they've already filled up the focus group. They don't need you to participate. Thank you for coming in today. Oh, man, I came in. I'm not going to get anything. But then the receptionist said, and we're not going to send you home empty-handed. We're going to give you the $60 we said we were going to pay you, the same that the focus group participants are getting. You're going to get paid and not have to do anything. And I'm just sitting there going, this is awesome. I get some free soda. I get money for just showing up. I don't even have to do anything. I don't have to do hours of research and blah, blah. This is awesome. And as they're passing the money out, one of the people says, hey, I was told $90, not $60. The receptionist says, oh, hold on a second. And so she walks out, and when she comes back, she says, yeah, we checked our records, and we did tell you that $90. And so to be fair to the rest of you, we're going to give all of you $90, not just the $60. And so we all received our $90, got our soda, and got to go home at less than a half an hour's worth of time. That was amazing. We've all had stories where we expected things to go one way, but they even turned out better than that. Perhaps you were expecting to get a small slice of your favorite type of pie, but instead you got a big slice. Or maybe you were going through a line for food, and your favorite part, the person before you got the last scoop of it. And you're like, oh man. And as they move and take away the empty tray, they bring out a fresh new pan, and you get the first scoop of the new stuff. Oh, that is so great. When you expect one thing and get something even better. Those surprises are amazing. Now, Christmas is a time that we oftentimes have surprises with the giving of gifts. That's why we wrap up presents or put them in bags, is so that people are surprised. Because they might expect or hope for one thing, but all the better when it's something even greater or bigger. Christmas is full of surprises. And the story of Jesus' birth, the Christmas story, is full of surprises. But in Matthew chapter 1, one of the Gospels, the very first thing it starts with is not talking about baby Jesus and all that. Instead, it focuses on Jesus' genealogy. It talks about his ancestors. And in this ancestry, it has a couple surprises in it. In that instead of just listing out all the men, it includes 5 women. 5 women who have 5 stories and 5 things to tell us about Christmas, about Jesus. Now, the women we've talked about in previous weeks, about Ruth and Rahab and Tamar, these women, they acted righteously and faithfully. They were filled with hope. Today, we're going to be talking about the woman named Bathsheba. Now, Bathsheba has a couple different stories in the Bible about her, but even here in the genealogy, it focuses on one in particular, because it doesn't even say Bathsheba by name, but rather refers to her as the mother who was married to Uriah the Hittite. And so we're going to focus on that story today. Now, this is about Bathsheba and a man named David. David, probably one of the Bible characters best known, even if you had never cracked open a Bible before or had gone to Sunday school, because David, he fights Goliath. We know that story, right? David, the shepherd boy, a nobody, small boy, faces the great Philistine Goliath, and with just his sling, he's able to defeat the great giant. It's a great story. And then it's not just that he was a beat the giant, but this shepherd boy was also a poet, a songwriter, a psalmist. He writes a lot of the Psalms in the Bible, and he grows up and he is a great warrior. It says that Saul killed his thousands of men, but David his tens of thousands. He becomes popular with the people. He does all sorts of amazing things. He stays loyal and righteous with God. He has a lot of religious fervor. He's an amazing man. And so when David becomes the second king of Israel and Judah, he is seen as the best of the best. Like, this is the people's top choice. This is a great king. And it says that David is a man after God's own heart. He is just really, really good. And so he has a very successful life doing all these things. But then, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, after we get into the story of David a bit, things are going well. It says that it was springtime and the troops had gone off to battle. But David had decided to stay back at the palace. He wasn't out with his troops where he was supposed to be, but rather had stayed behind. Not exactly clear why, but it was a strange thing and worth mentioning. And while he's at the palace, David, he looks out one day, and on the rooftops there is a woman bathing, and she catches his eye. And so he sends out a messenger. Who is that woman bathing on the rooftops? And the messenger goes and reports, oh, that would be Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who is off at battle. Sort of the messenger saying, hey, oh, here's the answer to what you're looking at, but wink, wink, nudge, nudge. This is not okay. Like, this is someone's wife, the wife of someone who's in battle, the place where you should be. Maybe take a hint here, David, Like, this is kind of out of bounds territory, right? Like, the messenger kind of kindly suggests this to David, but David, either being a little thick-skulled or just really determined, he brushes this aside, and he says, you know what? Bring Bathsheba to the palace. And so the messenger goes, summons Bathsheba, brings her to the palace, and David sleeps with Bathsheba, dismisses her, and she returns back home. Now, the king, David, he's permitted all sorts of privileges. Like, being king can be pretty great. There's all sorts of things you get to enjoy, but adultery, it isn't one of them. Like, that is clearly a no-no. And he has violated someone else's wife. He has gone and done something really inappropriate. And so when Bathsheba then says, hey, King David, guess what? I'm pregnant. Ooh, what is he going to do? How is he going to hide this? I mean, if the troops find out that the king has stayed behind, hasn't joined them in battle, but instead is sleeping with their wives, this is how he behaves while they're fighting on their behalf, they're going to rebel. They are going to mutiny. And so he has to think of something quick. He goes, think. How am I going to get past this? I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to call Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's husband. I'm going to invite him back home. And Uriah comes home and he says, hey, how's battle going? So good to see you, buddy. Say, why don't you go home for a little bit? Trying to pass the blame if Uriah goes home. But Uriah, he says, no, I'm not going to do that. If the men are off in battle, I'm going to stay sleeping outside in the tents and such. So he doesn't go to his wife. David tries again the next day. He tries to get him really liquored up to maybe go back to his wife, but he doesn't again. And so David goes, oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Well, there's not a whole lot of choices left. So David, he sends word to those in command saying, hey, Uriah the Hittite, put him in the front lines. Make sure that he doesn't come home. And so Uriah, he goes back into combat and he ends up being killed. When word comes back home, David goes, oh, shucks, that's such bad news. But that's just how war goes sometimes. Now, I said today's story was about Bathsheba. And I've been talking a lot about David here. And the reason that I've been talking about him so much is because the story doesn't flush out Bathsheba much. It doesn't give any sense of motivations or emotions. It's really unclear. And so people, they have a wide range of interpretation of saying, oh, she was a passive, unwilling victim, that there's nothing she could have done and it was just terrible for her. And some have painted her as an active seductress. We don't know how she is. It's unfortunate that as a woman, she is not flushed out and we don't learn more about her. Later in the stories where she shows up, we get to see a bit more of her, but at this point, we really don't know. And so when Uriah the Hittite dies, Bathsheba's husband, it says that she grieves. And we don't know how she grieves, if it's, crocodile tears, that maybe she was an active collaborator and saying, oh, I know we have to get rid of him, I can't have anyone find out. Maybe she's just faking it. Or maybe on the far end, she had no idea what happened and is just heartbroken that her husband died, but maybe it's also a lucky coincidence. Either way, we don't know what's going on in her head and her heart at the time, but we know that she grieves, goes through the mourning process, and then David marries her so that she, when she gives birth, would be giving birth as being married to King David. It doesn't sit right, does it? A lot of terrible things have happened here. And it says at the end of the chapter that the Lord is displeased. He has seen it all. David tried to cover it all up and everyone else is kind of just going along with it. But the Lord sees it and is not going to let this stand. He is not going to let deception and adultery and murder stand. He's going to act even if it is King David, the one after his own heart, the one that is elevated as the greatest king of Israel. And so what does God do? What does God do in this situation? Well, he sends the prophet Nathan to David, who confronts him with his sin. David takes ownership, and then Nathan says, there's going to be some consequences for what you have done. There's going to be some discipline. And one of those things is that your son, born of Bathsheba, your firstborn son from him, he's going to die. And after Nathan, the prophet Nathan leaves, the son gets sick, and he dies. At this point, is this enough? Is this justice? Is this right? Is this going to be the end of the story? Does this wipe the slate clean? Well, I think if we were judge, jury, and executioner, if we were writing the story, well, we might say, well, at that point, David is going to be overthrown. Everyone hears about this. They're so angry and disappointed. They toss him out of power. He is disgraced. He's going to be exiled, if not executed, for his crimes because he has betrayed the people's trust. He has gone against God's will. He is no longer worthy of being king or being honored. And Bathsheba, well, we don't exactly know what her role in participation, if she was pretty much innocent or if she was just as guilty as David. Wherever she is on that spectrum, well, maybe she becomes barren the rest of her life. No more kids for her because she was part of this sexual sin stuff. No more kids for her. Or maybe, like she would be so overcome with grief, so stricken with it that she would go into seclusion. Maybe she would be driven mad, or maybe she'd even take her own life. Like, poetic justice, that there would be some sense of things are right again. An eye for an eye, that pain would repay pain. But that's not what happens. No, something surprising happens instead. Instead of that, what should have happened, what happens is that David and Bathsheba have another son. His name is Solomon. Solomon, he becomes the third king to rule over Israel and Judah. And this Solomon is the one who leads Israel into their golden era where they are so rich and so productive and things are going so well. Solomon, he builds the temple to God that David wanted to. Solomon builds up great structures. Solomon, he is known for having great wisdom, known as the wisest man in the world. Solomon, he ends up writing 3 books of the Bible. Solomon, he becomes a real somebody. He becomes really important, even though he ends up having some big sin issues too. David and Bathsheba have Solomon. What was God thinking? I mean, that's crazy. Like, this should not be happening. I mean, Solomon should never have existed because David and Bathsheba should never have been together. Solomon should not have existed, let alone carry on the legacy. But what I love about this story at this point is that it's all about grace. Pure and simple, unearned, unexpected, unbelievable, undeserved grace. This story of deception and adultery and murder, like this should be pushing the boundaries of God's grace, where we say, oh, like God certainly shouldn't be able to give grace and forgiveness to this sort of stuff, but God does. God's grace is limitless. Otherwise, we would have seen it in action here. Now, there was a penalty for the sin. Even within grace, there is discipline, that there is punishment for wrongdoing. They aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, sometimes they go hand in hand with one another. And so even though David and Bathsheba sinned and there was punishment, there was still room for grace to come. David, he recognized his sinfulness. He repented. He shared it. And he said, God, I need to get right with you again. This was not okay. And so they lost their first son. But that wasn't the end of the story, because God didn't give up on them. He gave them another son. And you know what? Even though this world sinned and messed up, God didn't give up on this world, but gave up his son in order for grace to abound. In a sinful world, God sends his grace to us. Author and pastor Andy Stanley has some really great thoughts on this, about how Matthew, when he writes up the genealogy of Jesus, when he's writing this up, having seen and experienced Jesus as Lord and Savior, the one who's crucified and rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, the disciple Matthew, as he sees and is writing this all down, he starts with the genealogy and laughing to himself. He goes, what am I going to include? What am I going to point out? And so he goes, I'm going to highlight a couple stories. He goes out of his way to highlight 5 women. And sometimes the stories he picks are kind of shocking, surprising. I mean, why highlight a story of national embarrassment? Why not say, David, the one who beat Goliath. David, the high king that everyone loves. Instead, he says, David, the father of Solomon, whose mother had been married to Uriah the Hittite. I think Matthew does this because it is important for us to know this is part of the story of Jesus. That Matthew knew Jesus inside and out, and Jesus is grace personified. That Jesus wasn't like the grace of the other religious teachers. Jesus wasn't like the grace that they had experienced in their own lives. It was that grace that they had heard and that God had given to people like David in the past. That this grace personified was the grace given to David and Bathsheba, the grace that they had experienced. Because in highlighting this grace that God had shown before and was now present bodily here, well, this grace that could absorb the full sin of that story, well, it could absorb this full sin of the whole world. Well, as we wait for Christmas, as we are waiting for the days to come, it's really about awaiting the coming of grace. That we get something better than we deserve. We were expecting one thing, but God had even something better in store. I mean, regardless of your past, regardless of your strains, regardless of your feelings, regardless of your failures, regardless of your doubts, regardless of anything that you have said or done that makes you feel disqualified or lesser than, well, the gift of Christmas to you is grace that is greater than your sin. That you are not defined by your worst moments, but by God's greatest. And when you know that grace, when you know and really believe and have brought into yourself this grace, well, all those problems of the past, well, they're not so embarrassing or shameful anymore, because those stories that used to embarrass you, well, you now present them as stories of God's limitless grace. It's why Matthew can say, David messed up big time, but all it did was show God's amazing grace all the more. And so may you know and be freed and remember and experience and share this grace this Christmas week. Friends, I send you out this week with this blessing. May God the Father bring your darkness into the light, that you might be freed. May Jesus Christ, his Son, bless you by giving you more and better than you deserve. And may the Holy Spirit use you as an agent of grace in a graceless world. Go in peace. Amen.